Prakriti, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Prakriti, and I lead global compensation programs at Diageo. And Diageo is a global leader in the alcohol industry. We have some iconic brands like Johnny Walker, Guinness, or for the tequila fans, Don Julio. And thrilled to be joining Ross on this panel.
That's what we should have put on our stand instead of Swiss chocolate, isn't it? Hello, everybody. Ross Elmsly is my name. I'm the head of the Solution Advisory team at beqom. If you don't know beqom, we're a specialist in performance management, comp management, and pay equity and pay transparency. So we're talking to you today about some of the common myths and misconceptions that exist around pay equity analysis. And we'll give you some best practices from a great example. So let's get going. So as I said, on the agenda, we're going to look at some of the common myths and misconceptions and how they can lead you astray. beqom works with more than 425 companies, so I'll give you a bit of the perspective of the global perspective, some of the common problems I see, and then we'll hand over to Prakriti, and she will talk about.
We'll talk about a little bit about our journey, what we learned from that journey, and a little bit about the next steps, what we can do to prepare now.
Great. So to start, let's look at a fundamental myth around pay equity, which is that I don't have an unexplained pay gap, or I don't have a problem. Now, this is a pushback that not necessarily people in this room are giving, it's a pushback you're receiving from your other stakeholders. And Prakriti will talk about her experience. It doesn't seem to be too bad in Europe. Many people in Europe don't have this pushback. But for those of you who saw Lucy Brown's presentation from Mercer earlier, she said one of the barriers that a lot of companies see is internal pushback, refusing to admit that there really is a problem. And sometimes that leads to arguments that your analysis is wrong, your tools are wrong. Another one I've heard is, don't we have enough HR policies? We've got a hiring policy, we've got grading policies, we've got pay bans, we've got everything under control. Surely we don't have a problem. So some of our customers are government agencies. Some of them have highly regulated pay, no discretion, very formulaic. And they still discover problems, areas of bias, pocket areas, or a problem across the whole organization. So just because your pay is well defined does not mean you don't have a problem. The other part of the pushback is also just sometimes it might be the head of a division, sometimes it's different cultures that it's just not much of a priority for them. And so therefore, while they say it might be a bit of a problem, we don't have the budget for it. So I'll talk generally about how you can address this pushback if you're receiving it, and then Prakriti will share a little bit about her adventures. I would start just with the fundamentals, which is a little bit of an uncomfortable truth, is that the pay gap exists and persists. And by the way, I say pay gap, I don't just mean pay gap, I mean pay equity problems, so inequality. And the evidence for that is everywhere. The study at the bottom was just released 3-4 months ago in Denmark. Starting graduates straight out of university in their first job, there's a pay gap between men and women. I mean, the problem is not just going away, it is there and it's persisting. So the problems, of course, in hiring, we also all know that there's a problem in the ongoing relationship. For example, women often don't self-promote as much as men. So you might have performance management problems, you might have problems that come from hiring. And again, we see this because some of our customers, they spend X amount of money closing the pay gap year one. You do it, you tell the business, done, solved, great. What happens in year two? The pay gaps come back because of new hires, promotions, transfers. So these things together definitely drive a lot of issues. Okay, so Prakriti.
Talking about the first topic that you mentioned, securing budget or getting the funding, ensuring that our leaders understand that this is an important topic. I think having a large presence in Europe and UK, there's already some buy-in. There is awareness in the organization, within the leadership team, as well as there's a little bit of a push from the boards already for organizations that are based in Europe or UK, and that kind of worked for us. We started building or fixing our foundations about 3 years ago, and started with standardizing our work architecture, our job architecture, because that's going to be key when we start doing our pay equities analysis. And post that, we started looking at our pay principles with that lens, with a fair pay lens. And we started doing a few pilots before we finalized our pay equity analysis model, right? And those pilots really helped us. We didn't want to wait for perfect data. I think a lot of us trying to get to a perfect database, perfect pay information, benefits information first, but we wanted to do some pilots to see where we are. And it really helped us build models, figure out the kind of technology we may need to scale up. And post that, we started running pay equity studies across various countries. We plan to cover all countries globally before the end of 2025. So it's been a journey. The results that we see in various countries are very different, sometimes because of local nuances, sometimes maybe because how the jobs are structured, or the demographics could be very different, what we see in different countries, and there's no one-size-fits-all kind of a solution. So it's important to be on this journey. That's what kind of I have learned from it. And I think the most important piece of this puzzle is going to be pay communication, right? Especially with the transparency, EU Pay Transparency Directive coming in. And it's extremely important to build manager capability. They are the ones who are going to be the storytellers for us. So that's what's going to be our next focus, to build capability for our people managers, and also educate them enough on this entire topic of pay equity and fair pay, so that any pay decision that they're making at the time of hire, at the time of promotions, pay review, they have this at the back of their mind, that how will this impact pay equity? Otherwise, we will be correcting pay gaps and then creating some more. So how can we give them visibility to the pay equity studies as well? I think that's what we are focusing on.
Brilliant, thank you. And remember, you can always put your questions in Slido. I've been told to remind you of that. Okay, we'll have a look at another myth. And to resolve this myth, we have to do some data analytics. So I hope you had coffee at lunchtime, because we're going to get technical. But it's easy, don't worry. So the myth is that only women are affected by pay inequity. And if you believe the myth, it will take you down the wrong path, which is, let's give raises to underpaid women. And the truth is much more complicated and much more nuanced. And so to address this, you need to look at, first you need to start on the fundamental definitions. So you'll all probably know about the average gap. The average man, the average woman, you'd average it out, you get an average gap, maybe of 10%. But then for those of you who've been working on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, you'll know the term adjusted pay gap. So adjusting for factors that explain differences in pay, such as grade, seniority, location, that can explain some of the differences, but not all, and usually there's something left over. So in this example, 4%, and that is the adjusted or equal pay gap. And that's what you need to know for the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It's one of the key requirements. So the methodology to calculate that is done using a regression model to predict your pay. And so let's take Peter. He's a grade 6. He works in London. His job family is IT. And there may be other factors in your businesses that explain pay. So those, once you build up the regression model, that allows you to explain the pay or predict the pay for each employee. So you've got the predicted pay, and then you've got the actual pay. So in this example, he might be earning 60,000. The predicted pay is 54,000. You've got a gap. And that gap is the outlier percentage, okay? So the difference between his actual pay and his predicted pay. And then you do that for all your employees, and you do an outlier analysis. So what does that mean? You take the actual pay and the predicted pay, and you take the difference between the two. So Pierre, his actual pay is higher than his predicted pay. He's a positive outlier. So he goes above the line. The line is 0. Okay? And when you do that for all your employees, you'll end up with a graph that looks a bit like this. So as a reminder, and if I just do that, so the line is 0. An employee who is below the line is below their expected pay. You've predicted their pay at 40K, they earn 37, for example. Someone who is above, and you can see the people who are far above, based on the factors that drive pay in your business, you think they should earn 100, they actually earn 150. So, what does this graph tell you? And the thing you may notice right at the bottom is it busts the myth immediately that men and women are equally likely to be well below the expected pay. So pay inequity can affect men and women. I should say at this point, this is not a Diageo data set. This is not a client data set. It's a generalized data set from academia, but we see the pattern again and again and again and again and again. So it's a pretty relevant example. So immediately you can see that in this business, and your business, you may well find the same thing, you're going to have negative outliers who are both genders. Oh, sorry, I should have also said for the purposes of analysis, we're just doing gender here. We all know that there's also other factors at play, ethnicity and other pay gaps. But yeah, we're just focusing on gender for simplicity. The next thing this tells us is that women are far more likely to be below their expected pay and men are far more likely to be above their expected pay. So the people who fall, or the employees who fall around the middle, they are at your expected pay. So they're not an outlier. The model explains their pay really well. But what's interesting is the difference in the percentage, where the line intersects. And so the distribution, how many women are below that line, how many men are above, is also an important factor. And then the third one is really interesting, and that even in your highly paid women, the women who are above what you'd expect them to be paid, they're much less likely to be well above and much more likely to be well paid. So what this means is a few things. Number one, it busts the myth. It's not just the underpaid or the low paid women who are affected, but also you might need to be prepared to justify raises for some of your highest paid women or some of your overpaid women, which, to the budget holders can seem a bit counterproductive. So this type of analysis will allow you to, what we call, identify the right problem. For your business, you can identify those pockets of bias, those problem areas, and decide what action to take. Okay, I hope that wasn't too technical. I promised it wouldn't be hard.
So thanks, Ross. So once we do this pay equity study, I think we may find some pay gaps or we may not find some pay gaps, but mitigating risk when you find pay gaps at the bottom is much easier, less complex than closing pay gaps due to higher paid male employees at the top. What are we going to do? Are we going to put the higher paid female employees even higher? Some of that could be out of our range. What do we do? So managing that risk is much more complex and will take longer for us. We need to govern pay much more closely. People with larger pay ranges are facing more issues with this, with those outliers at the top. Do we slow people down? So that needs further investigation and a lot longer. For example, it could be due to some people who are ready for their next level. It could be because it could be due to compression. We have a lot of new hires who are male employees who have been hired at the top of the range. So it could be due to various reasons, and this kind of pay gap takes much longer to fix and needs very strong governance, maybe slowing down a few people. But to Ross's point, I don't think just correcting salaries at the top really solves this issue. And that's the one that's been keeping me up. So, yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Timing and next steps. Actually, back to you, Prakriti, for this one.
Perfect. So I won't scare anyone, but we have to figure out our plan, how we achieve all of that by June 2026. That's one of our milestones. And by 2027, in most of our countries where we have enough people, we will start reporting. But depending on when your peer review cycle is, you may have 1 or 2 more peer review cycles prior to that. And that's the best opportunity for us to maybe fix some issues. And it's important to get started now so that we can take those opportunities. And for that, I would say, we just need to get started. It may get a little overwhelming. We may feel that we don't have all the data, but we just need to get started, and we'll figure out along the way, like we are doing at the moment. Yeah.
And one other point is, of course, in June 2026, you need to notify their employees of their rights, which is Article 7, I believe. So how many of your employees are going to accept that offer and say, yes, give me information about my pay? Is it 50%? Is it 70%? So how are you as a reward or comp team, are you ready to respond to that demand? And of course, as Prakriti said, are your managers going to be trained to have those conversations? And there's a lot in there because a lot of the companies we speak to, they're focused on the June 2027 reporting deadline, but pay transparency, I would argue that the demands your employees will put on you is probably an equally large problem.
Yeah. It could take just one tweet from Taylor Swift for all employees to ask for that information in June 2026. So.
Great point. And that also brings us to the last myth, which Prakriti mentioned, which is a lot of the companies we talk to, we can't start, we don't have good data. You know, our grade data is inconsistent, we have different HRISs in different countries, whatever the problem is. But it's actually a bit of a myth. You don't need perfect data to start. You can find meaningful actions to take even without perfect data. And so we often say don't let perfect get in the way of good. With only 2 comp rounds left and the clock ticking, the sooner you start, the sooner you can identify action to take. And that's, of course, good for you and from a compliance point of view, but also you might just find, even if you're a small business, you might just find 1 or 2 employees who are unfairly paid. And if you fix that, you've done something good. Even if your data is not perfect, you can still find problem areas and take action to you. And that will close your pay gaps, but it's also, of course, the right thing to do. So, in summary, we come to the end.
Yeah.
I'll take this one. So, if you are getting internal pushback, having trouble securing the budget, having trouble from perhaps other people who don't believe the problem is as big as it is, there's loads of information out there that unfortunately shows the pay gap persists and exists and is going to be very hard to get rid of unless we take additional action. The existing policies are not enough, so it does take extra work. We talked about running regression analysis. That will allow you to identify your outliers, identify what drives pay in your business, and of course, then you can start to take action. And lastly, get ready now. I think some of the other speakers have also talked about it, but I think it's absolutely true.